Okay, so we're going to have a look at Checking Out My History by John Agard. What we're going to do is annotate the poem. We're going to look at it line by line. And then at the end, I'm going to discuss some of the features of structure and form and some of the patterns if you consider the whole poem. So before we begin, just to remind you that this is part of the Power and Conflict AQA English Literature Anthology. Therefore, it's important to have in the back of our mind some ideas about how power and conflict work in the poem. So we know that this poem, there's a sense of conflict between the speaker and the way that their education ignored significant figures from their own history. And this is a form of oppression because it disempowers individuals if specific and significant ideas about their own culture, their own ethnicity, their own identity are withheld from them. So this is what John Agard calls the Eurocentric view of education. That is often the main view that is sort of put forward, particularly for him growing up in the colony of Guyana, which was a former British colony. So before we begin, I just want to um, say a quick thing about Creole, which is the dialect that this um, poem is written in. And you'll notice from the first line, dem tell me what dem want to tell me, from the first stanza, that the version of English here is not what we might typically expect to find in a poem. It is not written in British standard English dialect. It is written in a Creole dialect, which might represent more closely the type of dialect that John Agard might speak. And two things about a Creole. Firstly, a Creole is sort of a contact language, and it comes down, passes through generations where two cultures need to communicate. Um, Historically, often this is when a powerful country might be exploiting or colonizing a less powerful country, and the two languages spoken by the powerful country and the less powerful country sort of clash, with the less powerful country sort of taking on aspects of the more powerful country's language. You find Creoles that are based with around English and French and Spanish, but they're sort of a mixture of different languages. That doesn't make them any less sort of worthy or important. For John Agard to decide to use his Creole dialect is something that he talks about as celebratory. It's a celebration of his own culture and history, this choice of dialect. And if you're confused by the word dialect, it just really means the word choices and the way that um, words are ordered. So that's what I wanted to make sure you understood about sort of the words and the phrasing and the way some of the words are spelt when we read this poem. Okay, so let's have a read of it line by line. So the opening stanza, them tell me what them want to tell me. Now, you'll notice that this line, them tell me, is repeated fairly frequently across the poem. And this them represents those in power, and here it represents the people who are providing the poet with his education. Now, we know that dem is capitalized, which kind of makes them sound like a group of people. And we also know that if you're just being told things, you don't necessarily have a lot of power. You're being disempowered because you're only hearing what you're being told. So this links to the education provided to him in his home country of Guyana, and it was what he calls Eurocentric. So the version of education he received privileged European history, European ideas and events, and ultimately kind of events that might be more significant to white history, other than Black or Caribbean history. So Dem tell me what Dem want to tell me. And what is the effect of this on the speaker? Well, because he's only being told these things, he is blinded to his own identity and his eye is bandaged up from his own history. So is this sense of his history being deliberately withheld? Having a bandage in front of your eye, that means you're unable to see, you're blinded. So his own history is hidden by the powerful forces, those controlling, receiving. So a couple of things to say about the word blind here. So to be blinded obviously is literally not to see, but it's also can be interpreted as a painful thing. You know, to be blinded might cause you pain. So I find the imagery quite painful there, and this is where we get one of the key conflicts in the poem, that he is having so many significant things withheld from him that he feels cut off or disconnected or displaced from his own identity. So them tell me about 1066 and all that. Them tell me about Dick Whittington and he cap, but Toussaint Louverture, no, them never tell me about that. So I'm not going to stop and explain every single historical event or sort of character from folklore, myth that is described in the poem. But you just need to kind of understand. You may have heard of the Battle of Hastings in 1066. That these sorts of things are linked to this Eurocentric, or in this case, a very British sort of. Sorry, my focus there. That he's receiving. So that is one of the things that he wants to bring our attention to. And actually, it's these figures like Toussaint he's never told about. He's never told about these people. So in many of these stanzas, we find him listing the kind of these insignificant things that don't really feel like they're part of his identity. And then the stanza builds up, and by the end, we have these more significant people here. And then we notice a complete change in the way the poem is laid out and structured when Agar discusses these figures from Caribbean and a Black history, which for him are much more pertinent and important to his own identity. So here we have Toussaint, a slave with vision, licked back Napoleon battalion and first Black Republic born, Toussaint the Thorn, the French, Toussaint the beacon of the Haitian Revolution. So when he discusses these figures, we notice that it shifts from sort of this normal typeface to italics. We notice that the structure of the stanza has much more freedom. We notice that rather than these quite regular rhymes at the end, dat, cat, and dat, we have a lot more of a freer structure. And there is still some rhyme, you know, thorn and born. We have half rhymes like beacon and revolution or Napoleon battalion, but the rhyme scheme is a lot more free, and that's something I want to discuss at the end when we look at some patterns across the poem. So Toussaint is a very significant historical character who led the Haitian Revolution, which helped form or did form the country of Haiti when slaves rebelled against their sort of colonial masters. So we can see this idea of licking back Napoleon, so fighting back against this Napoleon, who we know is a powerful general. You know, this makes Toussaint seem like a very powerful character. The idea of having vision, you know, being able to see into the future, not literally, but actual, maybe it's about ambition here. So this character is a very sort of ambitious, powerful character. To be a thorn to the French, you know, you may know the phrase "to be a thorn in someone's side" means that you expose their weakness almost. So we get this idea that Toussaint is a powerful military general, and to be a beacon is quite an important thing as well. A beacon is like a lighthouse. It provides light. and it guides others. So what can we think about with all these images of light and power and aggression? Well, this helps us understand how important Toussaint is to the speaker and his sense of himself, learning about these historical figures, these figures that were withheld from him during his education in what was then a British controlled Ghana. Okay, so now we revert back to the different voice in the poem almost. Then tell me about the man who discovered the balloon, the cow who jumped over the moon. Then tell me about the dish ran away with the spoon, but them never tell me about Nanny de Maroon. Repetition of them tell me again, which you'll remember from the start, is about those in power, those who are controlling the education, telling them about these things that just don't seem significant to him. So the cow jumping over the moon is a nursery rhyme. And this idea of like they told me about these nursery rhymes, but isn't that quite sort of childish and trivial and unimportant? So, you get that sort of anger almost. Why are they telling me about these sort of trivial and unimportant things when they're not telling me about people like Nanny de Maroon? Just like Toussaint, Nanny de Maroon is a really important character in Caribbean history and a military leader and a sort of that was looked up to. And I'd really encourage you to spend some time after you've read this poem looking and trying to find out more about these characters. And once again, you've got these figures from white history. Here we've got nursery rhymes, or sort of dish ran away with a spoon, more nursery rhymes. And then towards the end of the stanza, we get this build up towards the things that he was never told about. And it's like the stanza sort of ends with a climax, and the most significant thing is in the stanza here is Nanny de Maroon, just like it was Toussaint previously. So we once again, we just readjust the camera's focus. We once again have this freer structure. We once again don't have the set strict rhyme scheme. We have this shift to italics rather than a standard typeface. And here we have Nanny, seafar woman of mountain dream, fire woman struggle, hopeful stream to freedom river. So once again, you might be thinking, what does it mean to be a seafar woman? I would once again, a bit like with Toussaint, this is about having vision and ambition. Being able to kind of inspire others as a leader with your vision and your ambition. And if you do look into Nanny de Maroon, you see once again, like Toussaint, she was uh, trying to resist and fight against colonial powers from Europe who were sort of involved in things like slavery and generally sort of oppressing people in their own countries. So this is why we've got things like struggle and freedom river. So the idea that Nanny was trying to lead her people to freedom. And to be a firewoman, that's for me an image of power. We associate fire with heat and kind of danger and power, and to be a firewoman suggests that she's a very powerful figure. And you've got some quite important natural imagery here: mountain dream, freedom river, hopeful stream. This idea of hope, about overcoming your struggle, could be linked to her being a seafar woman, someone with ambition and a dream and a desire that she's trying to lead other people to. And this word freedom river, and the natural imagery and the beauty inherent in these phrases, I think really contrasts the other stanzas where there is very little imagery and kind of it's more listing these figures from white and European history Whereas the imagery included in these stanzas adds a lot more kind of inspiration, power, and kind of beauty and significance to these figures from Black and Caribbean history. Okay, so the next two um, stanzas are back to our other voice. Then tell me about Lord Nelson and Waterloo, but then never tell me about Shaka, the great Zulu. Then tell me about Columbus in 1492, but what happened to the Caribs and the Arawaks too? Now, I'm not going to spend ages talking about these figures from history, but we have Lord Nelson, who was a British commander during the Napoleonic Wars in the early 19th century. And yeah, okay, they told me about him, but why didn't they tell me about Shaka the Zulu? Why didn't they tell me about this military commander who was back and uh, why was this withheld from me? And then they've told me about Columbus in 1942, 1492. But what happened to the Caribs and the Arawaks too? Now, I do want to dwell on this for a moment because it's it's one of those. A lot of people have heard of Christopher Columbus. A lot of people have heard of the date 1492, and a lot of people will be able to say, "Oh yeah, of course, Christopher Columbus. Well, he discovered America, didn't he?" And well, of course, that's not true because when he landed his ship in America, he may have discovered it for the people of Europe and for the people of Britain, but of course, there were people living there already. And the Caribs and the Arawaks are both tribes people who would have been living on the continent of America at the time. And what happened to them? Well, they are sort of erased from history, and they are the victims of colonization. And once Christopher Columbus has discovered America, and Europeans start to travel to America and colonize America, it's tribes like the Caribs and the Arawaks who are exploited, and often the victims of horrific crimes, and eventually wiped out from America almost entirely, I believe. But again, that's something you can go away and research. So, then tell me about Florence Nightingale and She Lamp and how Robin Hood used to camp. Now, I think there's an element of humour here. Like, you may know a little bit more about Florence Nightingale and Robin Hood. She's more than just a lady with a lamp, and he didn't really just used to like to camp out in the woods. I think this language helps us understand just how sort of trivial and unimportant these people are from European history to the speaker. And it's that sort of quite dismissive of these people. Then tell me about Old King Cole's and Merry Old Souls. That's more of these British nursery rhymes, but then never tell me about Mary C. Cole. Once again, as we've mentioned before, the stanza sort of builds up in this crescendo point before the most significant character is mentioned at the end. So Mary C. Cole, much more significant to his feelings about his history, culture, and identity than these folkloric, mythological kind of story characters um, from British or European history. So we have this separate voice again here with the italics and the slightly different layout. We shift from this sort of quite regular rhyme scheme, and we have more half rhymes like far and war, and we also have kind of a less regular rhyme scheme throughout this part. So Mary C. Cole, who was let's read the stanza. From Jamaica, she travelled far to the Crimean War. She volunteered to go, and even when the British said no, she still braved the Russian snow, a healing star among the wounded, a yellow sunrise to the dying. So, Mary C. Cole was forbidden to go to Russia during the Crimean War, the same conflict where Florence Nightingale was a famous nurse from. But even so, she still went. She went build her hospital and helped sort of care for the soldiers during this war. So an incredible woman, and another character that perhaps John Agard feels was more central to his education. And there's this anger that her story was withheld from him when he was in school. So let's look at some of the imagery. So this idea of traveling far, I think, connects her to Nanny de Maroon and Toussaint. This idea of power and bravery, ambition, traveling far, quite literally going to Russia, but also sort of seeing out her vision, being determined to travel to help people, and having this courage to disobey the British, who, as we know, were a large colonial power at the time. And we have some more bright imagery. Being a star reminds me a little bit of the Toussaint image about being a beacon. A star has this element of beauty, but also has this element of uh, um, of hope and being a beacon and a guide, which I think just is a bit like Toussaint and him being a beacon. These figures are inspirational and they inspire kind of others to follow them. A yellow sunrise to the dying. So we've got more colour and bright imagery there. And the sunrise, I think, could also be interpreted as a kind of an image of hope. When the sun rises, it's a new day. So if she is kind of metaphorically a sunrise, she's an image of hope for those soldiers who might be dying or suffering during the Crimean War. So I hope that you can see some of the connections between some of the imagery used for Mary Seacole, Nanny de Maroon, and Toussaint Louverture. We have lots of images of brightness, lots of images of kind of power and nature, suns, stars, streams, rivers, beacons. All of this is kind of important and sort of links together. Now, on to the final stanza. Them tell me, what them want to tell me. But now I'm checking out my own history, I'm carving out me identity. So this is a really important part of the poem, and I think always worth considering the last stanza and the last lines of a poem, what the poet chooses to kind of leave us with. So we know that this is a repetition, almost exactly of the opening lines of the poem, but there's a really, really significant shift here. All through the poem, Dem Tell Me represents the speaker as being quite passive. He is receiving his education. He's the recipient in quite a passive way of all this information that he's being told. And that is not a very powerful position. I think that represents him as quite powerless, just to be told all these things. But by learning about these characters, I think there's a sense at the end that he has reclaimed some power. It's the first time in this poem that we have the word I, this pronoun. And it's significant by this point that he's sort of, I believe, reclaiming the power and the agency. So that means he's able to act for himself. I am checking out my own history. I am carving out my identity. So I think it's really significant that we're left at the end with this slight shift from him being passive to him being active and beginning to discover his own identity for himself. And I would also like to talk about this word carving. You're carving out your identity. Now you might be able to picture what it is like to carve something, carving a sculpture out of wood or stone or marble. Now, it is a long process. It could be very hard work. It could be very arduous. but ultimately you are left with a piece of art, something beautiful, which I think is quite a nice way of considering this idea of him carving out and having to work hard to discover his own identity. It may be a difficult, long, hard process, but it's also a process where the end result is something beautiful. You could even also talk about the word carving being painful too, and the sense of conflict about having to discover the elements of his identity and history that were, to this point, hidden from him. Okay, I'm just going to finish with one or two points about the whole poem. So, I think we've covered the fact that throughout the poem there is a counterpoint of these two voices. But I just want to mention the rhyme scheme a little bit more. So when you have them telling me about Lord Nelson and Waterloo, but them never tell me about Shaka the Great Zulu, and we have the rhyme here, you know, in the first, second, and fourth lines, and then we have lamp, camp, soul, sea, coal. And I find the rhyme and the rhythm is a little bit like a nursery rhyme scheme, which again helps to us understand that these figures from white history, he was uh, educated alongside a kind of childish and trivial and unimportant. But I think that idea about him not being really interested in these figures is reinforced by the rhyme scheme and then the kind of different, freer rhyme scheme and rhythmic patterns here in the other voice. In terms of structure, helps emphasize the significance of these figures described in these parts of the poem. And lastly, I want to just mention punctuation. I don't know if you'd noticed this when you read the poem, but there is not a single punctuation mark. Now, this is quite interesting. I think it prevents the poem from having lots of pauses necessarily. But I think we can also think about punctuation as sort of a set of rules that you impose on language. So you could argue, I think, that the lack of punctuation is the poet's way of sort of going against these rules and refusing to use them. So in many ways, it's quite rebellious, but it also shows a lack of conformity, which I think links to his decision to use the Creole dialect. Now, he's not conforming to standard English grammar or punctuation. He is embracing his own Creole dialect, and I think this is reinforced by the lack of punctuation, which shows the poet's desire to break free of the rules and the constraints which were enforced upon him growing up in a British colony and embracing this kind of freer way of expressing ideas in his poem. All right, thanks very much.